swiftly move on to we'll swiftly move on to our first panel of today. We have 5 papers. The title of the panel is Bureaucratic Populism and its Implications. No surprise here. So the first paper will be by Mark Duckworth, and it's titled No Public Service, No Democracy, Why Populist Administrations Are Dismantling the Professional Public Service. Mark works at Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. He's also the co-director of the Center for Resilient and Inclusive Societies, a senior research fellow, and also senior political advisor to the Executive Dean Faculty of Health. Before joining Deakin University in 2019, Mark had more than 30 years experience in the Victorian and New South Wales public sectors. He held many senior executive roles, including as Executive Director of Governance, Security and Intergovernmental Relations, and as Chief Resilience Officer in the Victorian Department of Premier. He previously worked at the New South Wales Cabinet Office, Sydney University Law School, and the Victorian Law Reform Commission. In 2007 Australian Day Honours, he was awarded the Public Service Medal. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
I have some slides. Do I press the button? I'll let you. Thank you very much. What I'm going to talk to you today is about some ideas I've been thinking about relating to what's been happening across the world in terms of bureaucracy, a relationship with political institutions, looking not just at those countries which we're talking about as being authoritarian, but some of the broader trends which are taking place in the United Kingdom, Australia, United States, which also have some broader implications in terms of how we understand what bureaucracy is. And I think one of the things is, as I said, no one ever lost votes attacking the public service. Ezra Suleiman, in his book from 2003, Dismantling Democratic States, commented on the relentless and prolonged assault by politicians on the competence and motives of their government bureaucracies as slowly undermining those bureaucracies. And from Suleiman's point of view, this is a deliberate strategy which was undertaken in order to justify the takeover of state institutions. So I've got a number of questions here, which is, does maintaining democratic order require an independent, apolitical bureaucratic machine? Can we reconcile kind of the main tenets of a kind of Weberian public service with a rules-based one with the needs of political administration, which sees itself, because of being voted into power, justified to implementing its platform? And there's also one of the themes I want to look at, and it touches on some of the things we mentioned before, is that we have a trend here around, authoritarian populism, but also an increased demand for community agency. And those things are running in parallel and, in my view, actually have a similar cause. And I'm focused through this on some of the Western concepts of bureaucracy, which of course have been highly influential around the world, but there are other concepts as well. But within Europe, within Australia, United States, and also other places which are linked to them, the concept of bureaucracy have followed these trends. If you say, what is the kind of accepted norm about what a apolitical bureaucracy should be, this is the objectives section of the Victorian Public Administration Act. And the objects of the Act are, one, ensure the maintenance of an apolitical public sector. And I think the other key thing is ensure that employment decisions in the public sector are based on merit. Because one of the key methods of regimes seeking to politicize the public sector is clearly to make appointments for political rather than merit reasons. In compressing 1,000 years into one slide, I think that one of the things is, of course, that the bureaucracy as we see it today is a relatively modern construct existing, in its current form, maybe 150 years, and developing in the previous century. But in the United Kingdom and across the rest of Europe, what we consider to be the bureaucracy was originally from people in the personal service of the monarch, and they didn't distinguish between the personal interests of the monarch and the matters of state. Then various institutions during the 16th and 17th century grew to be established. And one of the key things that's had enormous influence, not only in obviously Britain and Australia, but around the rest of the world, was the development of a separation of the role of the head of state and the head of the role of government in 18th century Britain, which has had profound implications and for people's understanding of the role of the executive, legislature, and judiciary, and these concepts had moved into public administration around the world. One of the things, however, was that despite these changes, public administration were characterized by endemic corruption and nepotism. There were no public appointments. It was all done on patronage rather than merit. Running alongside this in the 19th century, you have the growth of professionalism, doctors, lawyers, engineers, some of the many institutions which exist to regulate professions and set standards and so on grew in the 19th century. And this also began to apply to public servants. The most influential was this report called the Northcote-Trevelyan Report, which really, its main recommendations was that civil servants should be recruited by open competition, promotion on the basis of merit, UK reforms from the late 1860s. This was adopted also in the US by the Pendleton Act. And in Australia as well, we saw in 1883, for instance, in Victoria, before Federation, there was legislation that said basically that people had to be employed on the basis of merit. The Public Service Board was set up. There existed similar structures across Australia, and that Public Service Board existed until it was abolished in 1993 by the Kennett government. The other key thing, of course, is the strong influence of Weber's understanding of bureaucracy and the characteristics of a model bureaucracy about hierarchy and authority, appointment by merit, politically neutral, specialized division of labor, efficiency. And so the idea of the public service as a distinct professional service which would remain, whoever happened to be in power, was established across Europe, United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all sorts of places. So it's been one of the prevailing ideas. And even in the 1976 in Australia, the Royal Commission of the Australian Government Administration described the public service essentially as following that model. However, one of the things is that this model, which might seem to be the norm, in fact, really only lasted around a century before it was under sustained attack. Eugene Kamenka commented in 1978 that there's been growing disenchantment with those rational legal modes of life, administration and goal-seeking, with Max Weber and many others saw as the specific contribution, Western contribution to history and civilization. Objectivity has now become a dirty word, a synonym for the unfeeling. So the idea of the machine, which was impersonal, which was apolitical, was regarded as being not responsive to the demands of the people. And there are all sorts of reasons for this in the crises of the 1970s, fiscal crises and other crises, and concepts of governmental waste have these impacts. One of the things is that this began to have influence around the world, including in Australia. It's one of those paradoxes that people often think of, populism and challenges the public service as being a kind of a right-wing authoritarian issue. But within an Australian context, it was actually the Whitlam government that began to take this apart by the growth of ministerial offices, appointment of ministerial advisors. And this is a trend that's happened in Australia considerably. There's much public comment on the size of ministerial offices and their role in relation to the public service. While today the public service is often seen to be somehow part of a liberal deep state trying to prevent right-wing populist leaders implementing their will, Whitlam's view was that the public service was in fact going to be an impediment to his reforms, and he began to undertake major changes. The two things happened at the same time, and I think this is one of the key things I just want to talk about. So you have the rise of the demand for what one can call the collaborative state, right, with which citizens should be involved. There should be community agency. At the same time, there's increasingly authoritarian leaders who seek to capture the public service to carry out their programs. And so it's a question of where and how power should be distributed between communities, elected politicians, subject matter experts. And these trends, which seem to be in some ways in contradiction to each other, actually come from the same the same set of factors. One of the things that happened around the world, new public management, which was Clinton commented, we have the central tenet of democracy in the end is trust. We have a performance deficit that has led to a trust deficit. We can reestablish trust essentially if you can make public service more efficient. And as some people have commented, under the guise of seeking more efficient government, there lurks the danger of dismantling the state's instruments. We saw these trends across the world in which citizens become customers or clients. The view that, in fact, you should actually establish the public service to be basically a private sector model, which purchases ideas, which actually becomes less an institution itself and simply a kind of a contract manager. And we've seen the trends which are happening across the Western world of increasing the role of ministers, as I mentioned, private sector management employment practices as well. And the purchaser-provider split is one of the key elements of this. But the other key element of this trend, which is also populist in its nature, is this concept is the collaborative state, that top-down structures don't work, that you should have one that is focused on peoples and places, not just programs and outputs, value local informations and networks, encourage local priorities. And some of the key concepts of this is the lot of work around co-production, that you don't have experts creating and implementing programs that they are both designed with and implemented with people, and you have policies and programs co-produced. The other trend was also this attack, more populist attack, which was famously commented during the Brexit debate when the then UK Lord Chancellor Michael Gove said, "I think the people of this country have had enough of experts with organizations with acronyms saying they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong." And this was an attack on those institutions, including, the Bank of England and others, which says that Brexit was actually going to cause, multi-billions of dollars of cost. And the narrative, which came from the experts, counted the pro-Brexit views. And I think the way to do this was actually to buy into this attack upon the expertise of the elite, who actually were not representing the wishes of people. And I think that there is no doubt, as Rich reported the comment, distrust has been encouraged by those who have vested interests in discrediting experts because they want to advance a political agenda, be that in economics, climate change, health, or whatever, which may conflict with what expert opinion may be. And we can see this deliberate strategy being implemented in other parts of the world. We also have a problem, which is that trust is not distributed equally across our society. We have people, government officials, we have people who are educated, may often frequently have a high degree of trust in society, government institutions, while and who find it easier to navigate the systems of government. But one of the key things that's happening in Australia and around the world is that this distrust of institutions is something which is growing amongst people who do not see these institutions as serving their desire. And we also see that extremists are deliberately using this decline of trust to undermine experts. These are a couple of comments, one from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction about COVID. There's a clear parallel universe of rumor and false information. Its wide reach and ability to influence behavior could increase health risks and fuel racism, hate. The Director General of ASIO commented in 2019-20, the pandemic has been used by right-wing and issues-motivated extremists to promote their views. They're seeking to exploit social and economic dislocation. Their extremist ideology has been spreading more quickly and widely. And we see elements of this distrust happening, for instance, even this year in the United States, where there was widespread views supported by some government officials that cloud seeding had led to the floods in Texas. There was zero evidence of that. But populism thrives in the post-truth world. And I think that's the other key thing we need to think about. Disinformation is increasingly difficult to challenge and refute. And we see that these impacts, and we see populist leaders talking about themselves as representing the people, and increasingly the take-up of conspiracy theories to cast particular religious, ethnic, racial or political groups as a threat to Australian or UK or French or whichever identity and way of life. And part of this is driven by gaps in media literacy and understanding of assessing what is truth and what is not truth. So we've seen this phenomenon of relentless attacks and denigration of the state. The public sector as a whole has been attacked by that. And there's a confusion created between the need for democratization or greater efficiency and concepts that you need to have governments that represent the popular will. And that is carried in addition with the concept that, in fact, the bureaucracy as it's represented because of those 19th century reforms is in fact an impediment to, in fact, the popular will being represented. There does need to be, I think, a role for the bureaucracy in itself behaving in a way that rebuilds trust. And what some of the words that we don't hear used much, like empathy or respect or vulnerability or reciprocity, do represent a change which is kind of embedded in that collaborative state concept. So it is possible to see that, in fact, one of these trends towards a more populist bureaucracy does, in fact, increase people's involvement in government, while another side of it actually does the opposite. So the public service does not have to be an impersonal machine, but it doesn't mean that you actually have to have one that's at the whim of the political class. You do need some political decisions do need to be made on evidence-based policy. And in the post-trust and post-truth world, a political expert is actually needed. But one of the things that we're seeing is these two trends happening in parallel, one of them increasing community engagement and one of them is seeing increased political control of the bureaucracy. And those two things don't fit together. And it's a dilemma that Australia and many other countries are facing around the world. So that's a brief outline of some of my views on this question. Thank you.
We'll have the questions later.
Fine.
At the end of the panel. Thank you, Mark. Now we are moving on to our second paper by Professor Stephen Alomes, who is an adjunct associate professor at RMIT University in Melbourne. He is the author of 3 major books, 3 poetry collections, and co-editor of 7 books. 6 articles on populism include Defining New Populisms, Causes, Characteristics, and Trajectories, Australia and Beyond, and Populism and Political Leadership in France and Australia, Emmanuel Macron and Malcolm Turnbull. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks for your great paper, Mark. I didn't know much about bureaucratic populism until various discussions. Can we bring up my images? Somewhere there. A few months ago, there were some images. There were a folder of images. There it is. That's probably there, somewhere there. That's it, yeah. Okay, that'll do. We might bring up Orban. I didn't know much about bureaucratic populism, and I've worked mainly on Australian populism, but some work on France and the US, of course. And I want to talk to you about apples and oranges. The European apple, I don't know whether it's out of Adam and Eve or not, or the sun-struck Australian orange. Is Australia free of the heavy bureaucratic populism in Western and Eastern Europe? And now I wanted to show you these images, which don't seem to have come up for some reason. I've got it on my screen, but it's not. Does someone tell me how to bring that image up? We jumped up there. So the aim is to show that on the screen. I want to suggest that Australians, if you look at the images of Scott Morieson and Pauline Hanson, Australian populists, are actually quite, bring it down a bit to lost size, are quite different to the, you'll see from the images of Viktor Orban. Can we bring that up on there?
Yes.
Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. Putin, particularly that KGB public service exterior of an extremely nasty dictator. Orban, the man who was quite moderate when Fidesz began, but did not continue. And we'll contrast that with the fish and chips lady, Pauline Hanson, and the simple populist, Matey Scomo, whose definition of bureaucratic populism is we're going to catch the rorts and cheaters through robo-debt. And I suggest you all go off to see my rugby league team play at the weekend. So I don't think the images are going to come up. We might get them eventually. But I want to suggest that in Australia that we have not so far got the repressiveness of European bureaucratic populism. Although there are some tendencies that make me think that we might we might be going in the direction of America, where fear is at the centre of the Trump bureaucratic populism. And I met some demonstrators. I met demonstrators in Budapest last year, and the song they were singing is "We Are Not Afraid." So we've seen that in a very specific respect in Australia. The Zionist populism does not come up for some reason. Okay, yeah, the Zionist populism and the lawfare against various dissidents who are critics of the genocide are treated as anti-Semitic. So I want to think about the key differences between two sorts of populism. Grassroots populist discontents, that is populism arising from the people, and secondly, the weaponisation of populism by ruling parties and movements. And the second is particularly fits with the neoliberal and individualist populist discourse, which has now become to dominate much of the narrative, as in Mark's point about the decline of trust in government, etc., etc. Now, I'm aware that political scientists and political journalists have failed. They always use the term populism in their titles of their articles and in the first paragraph. But political journalists usually look at the details, what happened yesterday, etc., not fundamental questions. That'll do, yeah, thank you. And can we bring the other ones up subsequently? Yeah, okay. That's good, thank you very much. That's fine. Now, a very different populism, the theatre of Donald Trump. These are paintings by me. Putin, the KGB civil servant persona of the dictator, and you look at the superficiality of Morieson and the fish and chips lady Pauline Hanson. So there is a contrast, I think, between bureaucratic populism in Western and Eastern Europe and its relative lack in Australia. Now, political scientists have often failed for two reasons. One, like medieval theologians, they're really interested in the question of how many angels there are on the head of a pin. They spend too long talking about theorists and not enough time talking about society, causality, and the rise of neoliberalism as the predominant cause of populism. Populism is, as Ionescu and Gellner showed in 1970 in Canavan, it expresses emotions rather than instrumental policies to solve problems. It expresses frustration, disappointment, disillusionment, and feelings of exclusion. Now, that explained why Hillary's deplorables voted for Trump. That also explains why, as in a poem I have written, the bear defeated the brain in 2024. Now, the other weakness of political science is a focus on detail. Movements, leaders, institutions, ideologies, political rhetorics, electoral strategies and propaganda, etc. The exception in a way is some sophologists who wear a political sociology hat and they identify populist constituencies by age, gender, education level, income and region and ethnicity. For example, the constituencies of Trump, Le Pen and Hanson. They don't always completely understand that part of this story is their reaction against the rise of the inner city elites, the cool, cultural, digital people who the French called the bobos, bourgeois bohemians. So there are social, cultural and economic changes which intensify populism. Now, a further folly in some studies of European populism used to be a focus only on extremism because of a fear of a return to 1930s Germany and Italy. Now, that has some validity. We've seen the reactions against the refugee waves of 2015, the success of Le Pen and Farage. But it's not solely European. Consider Trump and the Mexican border, Australia and the boat people. But again, the danger is if you focus only on extremism, you're ignoring the mainstream and you're ignoring the neoliberal causes. Now, let me return to apples and oranges. Through weaponised populism in Europe, it can often be focused on ethno-nationalist, nativist and civilisationalist cultural opposition to immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. Now, in a way, this is weaker in Australia, as I will show later, because an immigrant settler invader colony, which began as a convict prison, has much weaker traditions of nativism and nationalism. Now, bureaucratic populism stresses the authoritarian and repressive character of populist governments. And we've seen that in Hungary with Fidesz and Viktor Orban, the multiple forms, the control of the mass media, government grant preferences to sympathetic regions, restrictions on George Soros, which drove him to Vienna and his university, control of the courts for political aims in Poland in particular. In the US, elected court officials and presidential Supreme Court nominations, state legislators gerrymandering electorates, redistricting, other electoral interference, ID cards, reduced polling booths. And under Trump, control of the media and the law through commercial threats formed a bureaucratic populist troika, law, democracy, media. Much easier in America because of the whole history of good and evil in the American story from the Revolution to the Cold War. Now, Australia has very strong populist traditions because, like the other Anglo-Saxon countries, it had enormous neoliberalism. And there have been some exceptions in Australia. For example, the government repression of whistleblowers, the Dan Duggan case, the American citizen pilot. But the courts have not been tarnished. Appointment processes and judicial decisions are less political than in the US. The media has not been restricted. And despite the right lobby and publicist groups' polemics, such as the IPA and the Ramsay Institute, there's been little curriculum interference except perhaps on the Middle East. Now, but at the same time, those ruling narratives have been echoed by the mainstream audiovisual media as well as the medocracy. So I want to suggest that in Australia and America, as new world and significantly immigrant societies, this has in some way saved them from till recently, from a complete polarity between nativist and the immigrant refugee other. But at the same time, as in Europe, the mainstream right have progressively begun to play with the threat to white Western civilization, often referred to as the Great Replacement Theory. That ideal in Europe has appeal in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Hungary, Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Scandinavia, and today in the UK. And we now see it in the US and Australia in the anti-immigration movement. In Australia, Scott Morieson, wearing his populist hat as matey ScoMo, tried two special variations of bureaucratic populism. First sending, quote, illegal boat people, refugees to Nauru and Papua New Guinea, and through branding his tough on welfare robo-debt. It's jumped away. It doesn't matter, it's fine. Okay. So we've shown them. Thank you. As tough on welfare rorters and cheaters. But in general, Australia's multiple electoral structures have prevented authoritarian bureaucratic populist governments taking power and distorting the American system, as in Orban's illiberal liberalism or in the current moves by Trump. It's very hard for a new world immigrant settler society to claim that nativism. Now, I want to talk particularly about in contrast to the late emergence of democracy in Europe, Australia's multiple electoral barriers go back in some respects over 150 years and include the following structures and traditions. The secret ballot, first created in Australia, compulsory voting, that is attendance at the poll, electoral commissions which do objective redistributions, not partisan redistributions, bicameral parliaments except in Queensland and two territories, which make it harder for a political grouping to have complete dominance of legislative power, preferential voting, which also reduces one-party dominance, a qualification to the power of the Governor-General as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the requirement they should act on the advice of the government, and the absence of both elected and or government-appointed judiciary, prosecutors, and senior police officers. Now, there are qualifications to this wonderful orange of Australian, comfortable, sunny populism. The qualifications to this liberal, democratic, and ideally pluralist mentality are ones because neoliberalist capitalism likes to undermine and reduce the state and its services. So let's consider the negatives. In the mainstream media, the dominance of the murdocracy, ethnic and racial prejudice, which came from the earlier period where the whole world believed in racial ideology as a science, the punishment of whistleblowers, even by Labor governments, restrictions on freedom of information, again, even by Labor governments, time delays and expensive outlays facing those dealing with the court systems, the media role, very specific, the media role of ex-Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pizzullo and some security heads, the rise of neoliberal corporate contractors in the public service, which fits with the things Mark was talking about, mainly by the three major accounting firms and therefore major with a neoliberal ideology. Finally, Australia has no Bill of Rights, although it has a Human Rights Commission. The dollar economics of democracy, the cost of elections now means that various forces which have their own interests like gambling, mining, banks, supermarkets, airlines, etc., in a country have great influence in a country made much easier in a country economically dominated by oligopolies. Australia has had only two constitutional coups in history. Jack Lang removed by the Governor of New South Wales in 1932 and Gough Whitlam in 1975. So in some ways, Australia still is the sunny populism overall. Now, while an immigrant society with historic invasion fears, it's arguably different to the bureaucratic populism of Europe. Even though, as I said, the Anglophone countries have had some of the worst experiences of neoliberal inequality. Australia's always had much populist rhetoric, mainly from outsider minority parties and movements. Populist governments are rare, however, despite verbal campaign invocations by right prime ministers like ScoMo and state premiers beating regional state pride drums. Similarly, bureaucratic populist interference with with judicial and state institutions is rare, although the Queensland restrictions on the right to protest may be spreading more generally. So finally, there have been examples of political distortions which are now appearing in the bureaucracy, but arguably half a century of neoliberalism has ravaged Anglophone nations the most. The consequences of inequality then gendered social populism as protest, with themes of inverted common sense, ideas, and you'll see this already, the ideas of reduction in government. But then, of course, we see its weaponisation by the conservative parties. So the story of people versus elites in Australia is still one of populist conflicts. But the key thing is to look at the role of neoliberalism over the past 50 years as the causality, and the question of whether Australia will also eventually follow much of Eastern and Western Europe and succumb, and parts of the third world, and succumb to more bureaucratic populism. So thank you. Thanks.
Forget your hand.
No.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you for Stephen. Yeah. Yep. Now we are moving on to our third paper by Nick Morieson, Compliance and Capture, Bureaucratic Transformation Under Populism in India and Hungary. Nicholas Morieson is a research fellow at the Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation, Deakin University. He is the author of numerous journal articles and 3 books, including most recently published one, Weaponizing Civilizationalism for Authoritarianism, How Turkey, India, Russia, and China Challenge Liberal Democracy. Over to you, Nick.
All right, well, after those 2 really interesting talks, I've returned, and we're taking a little trip now away from Australia, where those 2 presentations were focused, and onto 2 real populism heartlands, I guess you could say, India and Hungary. So my paper looks at how populist leaders are reshaping state bureaucracies rather than destroying bureaucratic institutions outright. They more often capture and try to repurpose them, changing their culture, their personnel, and their purpose from within. So I'm focusing here on 2 cases: India under the BJP and Prime Minister Modi, and Hungary under Viktor Orban and Fidesz. Both these cases show how bureaucracies that were once imagined as neutral and rule-bound can become tools of populist governance. I don't want to recapitulate too much of this from my earlier talk, but let's run through it quickly. So usually when we do think of populism and bureaucracy, we do tend to think of them as opposites. Bureaucracy usually works through rules. Populism expresses the will of the people, often in very emotional terms. Bureaucracy is said to constrain power, sometimes delay it. Populism seeks always immediacy and emotion. People must be saved right now from some calamity. So for that reason, scholars have tended to believe over time that bureaucracy is the natural enemy of populism, and in many cases, a defender of liberal democracy. In practice, though, what we find is that populists can take over bureaucracies and repurpose them, not by abolishing them, but by, as we shall see, capturing them in 2 different ways. So the paper asks a very simple question, which is, how can bureaucracies designed to constrain power, and even constrain populist power in particular, be captured and remade by populist leaders? So the answer I'm suggesting here is that there's 2 primary forms of capture. First, formal capture, which works through laws, constitutional amendments, and institutionalized restructuring. And second, through informal capture, which works through appointments, transfers, resignations, and the slow ideological reshaping of professional culture. So India and Hungary show both types, but in different ways. Let's start with India. So in India, bureaucratic transformation has been relatively gradual and definitely cumulative. The government of Narendra Modi and his BJP party has not suspended the constitution. They haven't openly dismantled institutions, but they are slowly changing laws. They're altering appointment procedures, and they're creating incentives that reward loyalty to the ruling party and its ideology of Hindu nationalism. And this has been described as killing a constitution with 1,000 cuts by scholars. Each of these legal changes might seem minor, but together they're eroding checks on executive power in particular. For example, the 2019 Amendment to the Right of Information Act. This amendment allowed the government to decide the tenure and salary of information commissioners by executive order. And it looks very technical, but what it really did was give the government leverage over officials who were meant to hold it to account. So the government in India also used financial and procedural tools to consolidate power. Amendments to campaign finance law legalized opaque so-called electoral bonds, which overwhelmingly benefited, of course, the BJP. Other legislation was passed as so-called money bills, which bypassed the upper house of parliament, which was meant to check them, but of course was not permitted to. So there was through these actions, the BJP gave the appearance of legality and democracy and proper checks and balances, but in actual fact, they were often removing these checks and balances and, in a sense, removing the legality. At the same time, the government worked to blur the line between the party and the Indian state, and indeed the people. Vacancies in oversight bodies were meant to look over what the government was doing, were left open until suitably loyal BJP supporters could be appointed. Agencies targeted political opponents while sparing BJP allies. Even the judiciary faced growing pressure through selective appointments and transfers. For example, in 2018, 4 senior Supreme Court judges held an unprecedented press conference to warn that the integrity of the court itself was in danger and threatened by BJP power. So populist control of the bureaucracy in India is very cultural. So what I mean by that is that beneath the legal reforms lies what has been called the saffronization of Indian state institutions. This means there is an aligning of bureaucratic culture with Hindu nationalist ideals, such as those consistently promulgated by Modi and his party and others. Officials who display ideological loyalty are therefore rewarded within the bureaucracy with promotions or visibility, while the old secularists who used to dominate and liberals and often Muslims and other people are often marginalized within the bureaucracy, transferred or quietly encouraged to retire. In the Indian Foreign Service, for example, ambassadors and diplomats have reported, quite a number of them have reported pressure to celebrate Hindu festivals abroad and to use more Hindi in official work. Training programs now include yoga classes and ceremonial events tied to Hindu-only culture. These shifts appear harmless, but together they reshape professional identity within the bureaucracy, replacing a secular and relatively cosmopolitan ethos that India knew for many decades with one based on Indian civilizational and religious pride and majoritarian Hindu identity. And the result is what you might call a hybrid form of bureaucratic populism, which is part legal and part cultural. It operates through law, procedure, but very importantly, through symbolism, through Hindu nationalist symbolism. The bureaucracy still exists, of course, and forms of accountability remain, sometimes only, however, on paper. The spirit of neutrality is increasingly, though, being replaced by a sense of ideological alignment with the BJP. All right, so let us quickly move over to Hungary, where we see something a little bit different. Hungary's experience under Orbán and Fidesz represents the other extreme, which is bureaucratic populism through rapid constitutional transformation. This is formal capture of the bureaucracy. After returning to power in 2010 with a 2/3 majority, Orbán's government launched what it called a constitutional revolution. A new fundamental law replaced the old post-communist constitution, and a series of so-called cardinal laws helped lock Fidesz loyalists into key institutions in the state. Civil service rules throughout this period were rewritten to make dismissals of staff easy and to reward political loyalty to Orbán. Hundreds of senior judges were forced into early retirement through these reforms, and their positions were naturally filled with pro-Orbán people. The National Judicial Office in Hungary was created by Fidesz to give a Fidesz appointee control over judicial administration, strengthening the party's hold over the judiciary. Media regulators and audit officers too were packed with loyalists. And what looked like legal reform was really systematic capture of bureaucracy throughout Hungary by Fidesz. Inside the civil service, ministries were centralized increasingly under the Prime Minister's office. It was a huge grab for executive power, all done in the name of the people, saving them, as we shall see, from things such as liberalism. And a new culture of compliance emerged within the bureaucracy because loyalty was now counted as more important than expertise. In the foreign ministry, more than 2/3 of staff were replaced after 2014. And they were replaced with younger and more ideologically aligned with Fidesz people. And so throughout this process, we see the bureaucracy that once embodied expertise and continuity after the communist period and technical competence began to become a political instrument of Fidesz. Orbán and his supporters justified these changes as a national renewal and by through a sort of redemptive narratives of saving the people from foreign ideas, particularly liberalism and progressive ideals, which he said would threaten the moral foundations of the country. Rhetoric he continues to use, of course. Indeed, he was defending this transformation as a defense of Hungarian sovereignty and Christian identity against liberalism and foreign influence. And bureaucratic control was therefore portrayed, even though it was somewhat authoritarian, not as authoritarianism, but as a form of patriotism, a love of Hungary and its Christian culture and people. And these constitutional reforms, because they're put into law and into the constitution, I should say, are quite difficult to remove. They're quite difficult to change. So it really means that Fidesz has transformed Hungary in a very profound way. A future government would need a 2/3 majority in parliament to undo a lot of these reforms. It would be quite difficult to do. So you can see really how Fidesz has entrenched itself within the state. It's quite difficult to remove now. And we might call this a rather complete version or vision of bureaucratic populism, which the bureaucracy is not only subservient to the ruling party, but also redefined as part of Hungary's sort of moral mission in the world to protect Christian culture from its enemies. So let's briefly compare the two case studies and see what we can learn. So placing India and Hungary side by side shows that bureaucratic populism operates along something of a spectrum. In Hungary, the process was rapid, formal, and legally entrenched. In India, it has been slower, more piecemeal, incremental, but the cumulative effect is strangely similar. In both cases, bureaucratic independence has been weakened and the boundary between the ruling party and the bureaucracy has become somewhat blurred. The comparison also highlights how institutional legacies shape the path of capture. Hungary's new and flexible constitutional order allowed for these sweeping changes. But India's older system, with its old colonial and executive-heavy design, already contained tools of centralization that could be reactivated once a populist leader like Modi was in charge. So we can see here the populists are adapting their methods to whatever they find locally, whatever opportunities they find. Another point of similarity is rhetoric. Both leaders justify their actions in moral terms. Orbán speaks of defending Hungary against liberalism and progressivism, Modi speaks of efficiency, anti-corruption, but also the need for Hindu nationalist revival. In both cases, bureaucratic capture is presented as reform rather as domination. Unelected officials are framed as corrupt and obstructive, while loyalty to the party is portrayed as patriotism and loyalty to the people. So in these cases, while the political consequences differ somewhat, the direction tends to be the same. In Hungary, rollback is nearly impossible without something akin to regime change or a very, very powerful new government that can build a 2/3 majority. In India, formal reversibility of these laws certainly exists, but the cultural change in the bureaucracy will probably endure after Modi has left office. It's become somewhat entrenched. Bureaucracies that have been ideologically reshaped, we might then surmise, do not always quickly return to neutrality. So the broad implication is that not only does bureaucratic populism erode democracy from the outside, or rather, the implication is that populism doesn't erode democracy from the outside, but bureaucratic populism seeps into the state and erodes it from the inside out as well. And once bureaucracies have become part of the populist project, they certainly lose any capacity to constrain or restrain populists. And so what looks like administrative reform is often the remaking of the state's moral foundations, as we've seen in these two cases. So let me conclude by saying that bureaucratic populism, although it may sound like a contradiction, is not necessarily a contradiction. We might think of it as a strategy or a discourse, but in all cases, it seems that it's a way for populist leaders to preserve the appearance of legality and bureaucracy while hollowing out their substance. Bureaucracies, therefore, that were once meant to protect democracy in bureaucratic populism tend to consolidate power. India and Hungary, as we've seen, show two routes to the same destination: the weakening of institutional independence and the subordination of the state to partisan populist rule. So the lesson for scholars and policymakers might be that democratic backsliding is not always sudden and it's not always that visible. It can take the form of steady bureaucratic capture, justified by promises of efficiency, through patriotism, appeals to patriotism, nationalism, or even moral and civilizational renewal. So thank you very much. I'll end there.
We are on time. We are progressing well. So we have two papers left. The fourth one by Lachlan Dowling, Survival, Sovereignty and Destiny, Centralized Power in Putin's Russia through Bureaucratic Populism. And let me introduce Lachlan here. He is a very bright third-year student at Deakin University, currently enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts and Laws, doing major in politics and policy studies, as well as a minor in history. That's a lot. That's good. He has most recently completed an internship with the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry, where he contributed to its blog and carried out peer reviews of manuscript subscriptions. Lachlan has previously contributed to the Publicus Consilium, Deakin Public Policy Review, with his article, Scott Morrison's Daguerreotype of the Mind, How the Job-Ready Graduate Scheme Threatens Higher Education's Grant Purpose, as well as in his capacity as editor. He is interested in political governance, dynamics of institutional power, and the true boundaries of civic engagement. And his title of today's paper presentation is Survival, Sovereignty and Destiny. Over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. Now, I have to say, just before I start, how lovely it is to be here today. I know it's quite unconventional for an undergraduate to be here. I'm truly conscious of that and pleased to be joining you here today as a speaker and a listener. Now, I do have to apologise in advance as well, unfortunately, with my presentation. Seems to have had some technological issues, but hopefully what I say verbally is sufficient. So really my paper falls around you want me to? So really my paper falls across three questions. The primary question is to determine what significance, if any, that context-specific narratives have in the study of bureaucratic populism. Secondly, to understand what has caused the hybridized regime that is the Russian Federation. And thirdly, to positively identify whether both faces of bureaucratic populism, the exogenous and endogenous, can exist in specific contexts simultaneously. Now, just as a refresher, our exogenous capture is the explicit politicization of state institutions by elected politicians, whereas with the endogenous transformation, what we're looking at is the adoption of populist rhetoric by the state institutions themselves. Without the presentation, the visuals will be quite formulaic, so I'll discuss how those three questions inform my paper's structure. There are three parts. The first part, titled Surviving the Transition. It revolves around providing historical context to Putin's incumbency. Specifically, we're looking at from the 1980s to the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and how that sets up the sorry state of affairs in terms of the instability and what has led to the hybridization in Russia. So necessarily that involves discussing the structure of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, acknowledging that it's not just a unitary state formally, it exists as a union of republics. That includes the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. And finally, we'll finish off that section with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The point here in that section is to begin a dichotomy. At one hand, with the Soviet Union collapsing, you have decentralization, the regions of Russia and the external territories, Ukraine, Belarus, etc. They've sort of split off from Russia. Russia has lost control there. And with that, we have Vladimir Putin on the other side of that dichotomy where he's trying to reassert that central authority. With the second part, of course, this reasserting Russian sovereignty. This involves a discursive analysis, referring specifically to Putin's speeches and addresses from 2000 to 2004. Wasn't necessarily intentional that I was stuck with that time frame, but of course there is a lot, and I feel that it was important to discuss the foundations of his presidency. It's not only sort of the fresh, clean break, or as much as is possible anyways for the time being with the Soviet Union. There was some relevancy with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine, of course, in 2022. And I think what I sort of set out in this paper shows how those events have been carried out along certain logic. So Putin's rhetoric is shown through four speeches primarily. It's his 2000 inaugural address, his 2000 annual address to the Federal Assembly, so the Russian Parliament, and his 2004 inaugural address, and his 2004 address post Beslan. Now, that was a terrorist event that I'll sort of get into later. Across all these speeches, themes are touched upon, including historical prestige, national destiny, unity, birthright, and Russia's so-called great power status. With the third part of my paper, this is where we're mixing that rhetoric that sets up the exogenous capture with the endogenous. So it's a legal institutional analysis connecting Putin's rhetoric to the specific changes that he actually enacted and the regime actually enacted. This touches upon all branches of the government as well as the federal regional divide. Again, Russia is still a federation. There are smaller administrative regions and republics. And all this goes towards Putin's attempt to reassert a central vertical of power. To go into more detail with the first section, surviving that transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, Of course, I've already touched upon emphasising the USSR's nature as a union of republics. The point here is to try and move away from Western conceptions or the Western mainstream narrative of the Soviet Union formally being this unitary one-party state. While that was what was effectively in practice, there's still formal recognition of a division of power between the republics participating in the Union. With this, I found two auspices of control. There's the first of all, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I discussed how that was prohibited following the August coup and after Mikhail Gorbachev's failed glasnost and perestroika reforms. And I frame these not as a failure to transition towards liberal democracy, as is sort of hoped for by Western Cold War paradigm, where it's the collapse of the Soviet Union is supposed to be this great paramount victory of capitalism over communism, democracy over one-party rule. With that and the collapse of the party, that leaves the second auspice of control in primary control, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The significance here is that most, if not all, state institutions of the Soviet Union are geographically located or were geographically located within Russia, naturally setting it up to be the most suitable candidate as the legal successor state to the Soviet Union. It was also the largest of the republics by economic power and geographical territory. And the point there, with the party being gone and Russia being left in its place just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapses, what I'm framing that as is Russia essentially losing control of itself as republics assert independence or greater autonomy and sovereignty through various declarations in the parade of sovereignty. It truly is a loss for Russia by their own point of reference. With the second part of the paper, Restoring Russian Sovereignty, again, this is the focus on the discourse of Vladimir Putin. This is where we begin to see the basis for Putin's exogenous capture. And we see his heavy reliance on crises. So at first, it's the instability he quotes in his 2000 inaugural address about the disorder and corruption that's evident in the regions of Russia. He blames the regional leaders more concerned with vying for power between one another, the republics themselves, and also internally within their own republics. And later, especially after the Beslan tragedy, he concerns himself more with weakness. For Putin, it's a cardinal sin. A weak state is ineffective, and there is no central vertical of power worth having under a weak state. With that Beslan School No. 1 tragedy, so in North Ossetia in 2004, 1,000 hostages were taken by Chechen separatists to make the point during the Second Chechen War of vying for their own independence away from Russia. This lasted 52 hours, leading to 326 fatalities and nearly twice as many casualties. The importance here and the priority of my paper is with these elaborate national narratives. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm framing that as much more simple than it has been set out, as it was simply a matter of survival. The perestroika and glasnost reforms were being pursued to try and find at the minimum effort necessary to preserve as much of the status quo as possible. With restoring Russian sovereignty and Putin's actions, what we often see is it's simply cast as just an authoritarian, a macho man sort of dictatorship. And there's elements in truth to that, but the point to make is that it's not so simple and there is some sort of nuance, especially looking upon his speeches. He calls upon a dictatorship of the law. He talks about sacred respect for the constitutionalism, law and order, his responsibility of not tricking. He says this explicitly in his 2000 inaugural address, of not tricking the Russian people. Now, most people choose not to take him at his word. I'd be inclined to agree, but the important thing here is his ability to play to audiences. He knows that for some foundation of legitimacy, he has to play to the preservation of the legal order. He knows that we cannot return to the past where the Soviet Union controls by coercion, explicitly anyways. There are democratic freedoms and progress, if only slight, that means there is some level of nuance in his rule, and that's reflected in the hybridization of the regime. Now, in particular with his 2000 federal address to the Federal Assembly, what's interesting there is his ability to play to audiences again. He actually sides with the legislators. He says that Russia's been had. They're all victims. They're victims of the regional leaders who are in that sort of people elite discourse. They're framed as the elites. They're framed as the ones subverting the people's will. And with Putin's constitutional order, we have changes across all branches of government. In the executive, we have the introduction by presidential decree of plenipotentiary representatives, alongside the introduction of federal okrugs, they're called. So these are just federal oversight districts that basically they cover the entire span of the Russian territory. And the idea is to oversee the regional leadership, the regional activity. Now, in the federal decree, it's sort of earmarked as a merely oversight capacity, that there's still supposed to be that division of power between the federal central vertical of power and the regions. The other thing that we're seeing, though, in the reality of the text is these plenipotentiary representatives have the right of participation in the regional governance. They have the right of free access to every organisation within each okrug. And further, what we're seeing is the types of people being installed in these positions from the outset. So there were 7 plenipotentiary representatives. 5 of those were formerly of FSB or military background. Upon those plenipotentiary representatives being empowered to staff their own offices, 70%, so 70% of all staff from all plenipotentiary officers put together were also formerly FSB or military. And that reflects the Siloviki rule of that sort of former class of military and intelligence officers. We also further see in the procuracy, which is akin or most closely aligned to our understanding of a prosecutorial department. It's not exactly the same thing because they're also charged with supposedly monitoring the constitutionalism and legality of government actions. Necessarily what we're seeing there is they are being used to pursue and enforce the Kremlin's rule. They will turn a blind eye to the actions and the illegality actions at that of Kremlin allies while throwing the book at those who are political dissidents. With the judicature, we're seeing a legal duality in the sense that on one hand, you have the ability of the courts to function as normal for the everyday ordinary disputes of the regular citizens, but when it comes to political matters or matters of national significance, especially to the Kremlin, they are either acting under direct direction from the Kremlin, although this is quite rare in most cases, and this is where I'd argue that endogenous form of bureaucratic populism comes in. They're actually trying to guess at what the Kremlin may desire or what the Kremlin may want. And in order to do that, and part of the reason they're doing that is also to stall judicial reforms that may take away the immunity of judges, reforms that may encroach on their ability to sort of not act as, or to act as active participants. Russia's not so much a adversarial system as an inquisitorial legal system. And part of that is their ambition to preserve that. As part of that, we see with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Yukos oil executive, he's prosecuted from 2004 to 2005. And here we're putting together the actions of the procuracy and the courts. He's prosecuted for a litany of charges. They're repeatedly supplemented and amended according to the European Court of Human Rights in 2020. But he's ultimately comes down 9-year conviction for deceit charges in relation to his running of that company. The caveat there, though, is that he was also an active political lobbyist early on in the 2000s, openly campaigning in opposition to Putin's rule. With the legislative, we're seeing the end of ex officio membership, the right of governors to sit directly in the upper house of the Federal Assembly, that is the Federation Council. That's removed by federal law in 2000, so Putin's coercion of the federal legislature to actually limit their own membership by passing a law is seen there. Really the point I'm trying to make as well is with that exogenous-endogenous relationship, it's also perpetual, it's a cycle, one feeds into the other, and I think that's also reflected somewhat in the concept paper where it said that the two concepts aren't mutually exclusive, that they can sort of have an interoperability. The changes to the legislature are further cemented with the alterations to the direct election of regional governors, regional heads of state in 2004. Instead, they're to be appointed by the federal legislature upon nomination by the president himself, and he also gains unilateral right to dismiss the regional heads of state if he thinks they've acted contrary to federal law or the federal constitution, or if the president himself loses faith in their ability to lead. The final stage is the regional appointees in the legislature. Putin, in ending ex officio membership, transitions to a system by which the regional legislature branches get the right to appoint one representative to the Federation Council, while the regional executive gets the right to appoint one Federation Council member. In effect, because President Putin has the right of the de facto right of appointment of these direct governors, he has the direct right, or the indirect right rather, to appoint half of the Federation Council. And if he's able to just, through the managed democracy of Russia, gain only a few more seats, he has the power he needs to pass any law he wishes. So in terms of my conclusions, the hybridized regime is best understood according to Russia's point of reference, not through imposing the perspective of the West or that Cold War paradigm. There is that context-specific narrative where, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were pursuing their own survival, that is Russia. And we see that through both Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin's actions. Ultimately, they both failed. Because of this, it is prudent that context-dependent narratives be observed in the study of bureaucratic populism. We see this particularly in the Russian context through themes of birthright, national destiny, historical prestige, great power status. When we put those two ideas together, what we're doing is improving the scope for identifying where exogenous and endogenous faces of bureaucratic populism can operate in unison, but also where those connections are looser and more disparate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have our fifth and last presentation of this panel by Kashif Hussain, Bureaucratic Populism and Civil-Military Relations in Pakistan, a study of institutional populism and hybrid governance. Kashif Hussain is a public policy researcher and practitioner with over 10 years of experience in evidence-based policy development, governance reform, and security studies. He is currently doing a PhD in peace and development studies from the University of New England, Australia, and has worked extensively in national health governance, counterterrorism research, and civil service reform in Pakistan. Over to you, Kashif. Is he online? Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for the nice introduction. My name is Kashif, and I will be presenting my paper on bureaucratic populism and civil-military relationship. As in introduction has been told, Pakistan has been a case study with Brazil and other countries, and it's, I would say, not a poster child, but a very good study to have how the bureaucratic populism works. So Pakistan has gone through in its 70 years uh, four coups, and every coup had a different reason. Generally, you had justified his intervention through national security and economic crisis. Yahya needed political stability. General Zia said there was mismanagement, especially in the economic affairs, and there were corruption charges and election fraud. He wanted to make Pakistan on the straight path. And General Pervez Musharraf, in the very last coup that happened, promised economic reforms and improved governance with his 7-point agenda. How military does the control, like how military has been blamed for taking uh, over 30 years, 34 years of rule, how they dominate. Their dominance is in these areas. They have economic control. Military has its own military business, which extends into real estate and agriculture and other parts of things, petroleum and stuff. They have now, I would say, encroached into the economic part where the chief of army staff is sitting in and has appointed top generals in economic ministries. There's a patronage system where they have driven a pandit driven system which actually undermines the civilian dominance, where everybody is looking over the army chief. And as you might have seen, our army field marshal was greeted by President Trump in his Oval Office with the civilian head of state. This gives to a hybrid regimentization where our democratic institutions work side by side in synchrony with our military leaders. The elected leaders work with the non-elected ones to work together for each other's benefit, which turns into dominance where they have media censorship and enhanced military dominance, where they can stop screening of any of the news that doesn't pertain to them. Even they can cut down certain keywords. Personalities have been shut down. I can give an example of Altaf Hussain and recently PTI Imran Khan. Now, as we understand, bureaucratic populism is not a word as per se, but it we can define populism like charismatic, popular, or bureaucratic. And what's the difference between them is charismatic populism is leader centric. It is relies on the personality and magnetism of a leader to pull the masses towards it. We have example of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. We have example of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and we have an example of Imran Khan pulling masses to his own words and his actions and his narrative. And then there is popular mobilization through mass grassroots driven movements, especially in recent times. There have been ethnically influenced movements that have been driven that, the Pashtun Tawas movement and others. And then there's bureaucratic one. In my opinion, bureaucratic populism is the institutional use of anti-elite rhetoric by state to legitimize its authoritarian control, where they say there's a corruption going on and the people are corrupt. And as Madi says, there's elite versus corrupt people with the poor people, where the elites are polluting the environment and they have to come and do the operation cleanup. So military and bureaucracy, they have been non-elected members, so they basically institute the populist narrative. The Pakistan ideology was developed by military general Sher Ali Khan, which was propagated in our own public narrative that Pakistan has been going on as a citadel of Islam and things like that. They frame anti-elite rhetoric where the politics has been framed as people who are virtuous should be put in place versus corrupt elites. And every coup that I mentioned earlier was against them, and they eventually became part of that elite. But still, the debate goes on. They want to legitimize control by through state mechanism. State uses various things. They use media. They use coercive measures, as we have seen. Musharraf tried to do his enlightened moderation through his state media. Putting on banners and putting on things. This was pretty much put to good use by the hybrid regime of Imran Khan, and currently we are seeing dissidents coming down, and India-Pakistan war has seen what the state narrative can do. Then they sponsor civilian leaders. Many of the leaders have been accused of being coming from the establishment, and the route leads to the general headquarters, the army headquarters, where they receive their directions and everything. The recent example has been Imran Khan, and even the current leadership in place is being accused of hand in glove with the military establishment. How they do it, they have competitive elections. We do have elections, but many of our like even the last election has been contested as being fair, and the leaders that have been elected are still not getting what they wanted. Their restriction freedom of liberties and political participation in the hybrid regime. If you are not with the state or with the hybrid regime, then you are sure to be taken off. There are many politicians who have retired from politics, very leading ones. One of them was our ex-prime minister. There's institutional bias also, where the state has favored certain elements to favor, despite having democracy. I would say democracy is in tension, or we are not working. The deep state influence, the ouster of Imran Khan has been termed as a part of a deep state involvement, where his own party members voted against him and ousted him. So one influence is that, and another is whenever we have some issue, we crop up the religious card too, where the deep state is very much involved. So Pakistan has been termed as a democratic facade with deep state influence, and very interestingly, all of the actions that have been taken by the hybrid regime, one way or another, they have been validated by the judicial. The recent example is the May 9th, 2023. People have been tried not under the civil code, but they are to be tried under military code and the special consideration. 26th Amendment was termed as a change that was required by the what we call it a collegial term of establishment. where the military and the political elites and the bureaucratic elites do come together and formulate the policies for the public. So, 26th Amendment altered the judicial independence, where the judiciary has to be assigned. Like there is no uh, independence of judiciary form, and there are two different courts now to deal with two different matters. As well, it was just one court dealing with all the constitutional and the civil matters, which leads to authoritarian control, where this regime has strengthened its power and focusing on more centralizing authority. Now, I've used three different, uh, I would say, theories to explain the hybrid regime or the bureaucratic populism in Pakistan. I've used securitization theory by Copenhagen School, Tilley's and Huntington's theory. How I used it, securitization is it demonstrates how non-elected institutions construct internal threats to sustain the hybrid governance. Internal threat has been constructed by, which is exemplified by the military's framing of PTI protests as a national security risk, and securitizing democracy with the control and the audience in is accepts the is shaped by the public disillusionment with elites. In Pakistan, this control is subjective, with the military having their own corporate interest. Economic ventures and elections are engineered, as has been alleged and proven, and political violence is done with a coordinated effort, where they see opportunistic and broken negotiations happen all the time. And we see violence as a governance tool to suppress dissident and enable bureaucratic populism. So my study was a mixed method, where I had quantitative analysis and qualitative interviews with 12 key stakeholders. They were unstructured. The stakeholders include former bureaucrats and army personnel, political analysts, and civil society activists, which allowed me to gain institutional rights. The major factor that came out was rhetoric, patronage, clean. They want to clean everything, and they want to legitimize whatever it has been done by both sides of the fence. Uh, what I have found was that there was judicial validation. The decision legitimized military intervention and eroded judicial independence. From 19, every coup had been judicially validated. And as I have shared with you in the recent this year, the trial of the May 9th uh, culprits are to be done under military court, not by a civil court. The military court ruling that reinforces their legality. Court, there was an amendment in the constitution which allowed, after 2014 army public school massacre, uh, that it has to go through military percent. Yeah. What I found was that there was governance failure, there was military hybrid regime, there was uh, like patronage system appointment to be made, which led to judicial complicity, technocratic issues, and patronage networks, where the military is linked with each other. Pakistan political violence operates as a normalized tool of governance, which is deeply ingrained in institutional practice. Rather than then, this is done by coordinated state violence, disappearance of the dissidents, and there are military operations currently going on in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where there's every hue and cry nowadays that they are done without any legal cover. Sorry. And there is opportunistic violence, May 12th, 2007 and onwards, arising from the electoral clash and their political rivalries going on. Recently, TLP, political party, tried to stage a coup, to stage a protest, and which was uh, brutally squashed. There have been persistent sectarian conflicts with unresolved disputes all over the Pakistan, from the Gilgit-Baltistan down to the Karachi. So my further analysis confirms that the militant groups in Pakistan, they actually capitalize political instability, and due to contention elections, there's an escalation of the violence. The violence is suppressed by not just by suppressing dissident through persecution, but also through forced disappearance. The bureaucratic populism anti-elite narrative is used to justify their repressive measures, and usually the development projects in conflict-sensitive areas is exacerbated by ignoring local dynamics, which actually transform the governance into the battlefield, where we currently see the Balochistan being pulled away from the Pakistan. And the violence that we see there is opportunistic, sectarian, and military conflicts. So I've given the comparative analysis: Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt. Erdogan has used reforms aiming at civilizing military influence with strong anti-elite rhetoric. Say, not the same, but quite opposite. Pakistan is being holding gone to this. But Egypt is continuing with Pakistan's strategy. With Sisi, he has militarized populism, where army actually controls the significant economic sectors and employ violence. Uh, so I would say that varying from a bureaucratic populism from military suppression to civilian reforms highlights their adaptable nature across different political landscapes. So my conclusion is there is a global implications for this. If there's a bureaucratic populism somewhere, it actually weakens state-society relationship, where the state actually prioritizes elite patronage or genuine participation, and it requires urgent reforms where the civilian oversight, military depolitization, and curbing of violence as governance is required, especially in my own country. I would admit that. And there's a collective responsibility, not just for Pakistani, but all over, to dismantle patronage and promote meritocracy. And what I would like, my recommendation would be depoliticize military, strengthen institutions by promoting meritocracy, which will later on build the civil society. So that's on my side.
Thank you very much. Now we have 11 minutes, maybe 15 minutes for Q&A. Any questions here? Yeah.
My question is from Professor Stephen. You said in your presentation that liberalism is the predominant cause of populism. So, but
Of neoliberalism, the rise of neoliberalism since Friedman, Reagan, Thatcher, and the general move to the right in the 1980s, it is neoliberalism which has led to populism as a form, initially a form of protest from ordinary people with a sense of both economic inequality and also a sense of social and cultural status loss, also accompanied, as we know, by the rapid digital change in our economies, which leaves people attached to older economies left out. So neoliberalism is the origin of grassroots populism, and the second phenomenon is the weaponization of populism by right parties from both movements, both marginal parties like Pauline Hanson and also mainstream parties. And it's become, as a dominant discourse, it fits with the neoliberal agenda, because what is the neoliberal agenda? Which is to reduce government. And that has become the dominant discourse, as well as in Australia, the discourse of right-wing lobby groups like the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs. So I hope that is clear.
yeah, actually, I was cognitively relating it with realism, to be honest, because realism is also a quest for power, and populism is also a quest for power. So thank you very much.
I actually particularly refer to neoliberalism as a return to social Darwinism. The winner takes all, the loser takes the hindmost. And we see that even in everyday life, that life in many ways has become more competitive, even in affluent Western societies. So social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest has actually become important. There are a lot of other complicated accompaniments like digitisation and consumerism, which are another story. But that's what I hope that's clear. So neoliberalism, not liberalism. Or only liberalism in the meaning of in fact, I refer to LCDs, liberal capitalist democracies, but we might say neoliberal capitalist democracies.
Yes.
And sorry, and my second question is, to be honest, I just first time heard the word deep state. So is it something that we use for establishment?
Usually, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I have a few questions here. First, for the panel, are there any identifiable stages or trajectories of bureaucratic populism as it evolves within a state? And another one for the panel again, how might bureaucratic populism vary across democratic, hybrid, and authoritarian regimes? And I have a question for Mark. What mechanisms can rebuild trust between elected officials and professional civil services? And for Stephen, how significant is media ownership, especially murdocracy that you called, in sustaining populist rhetoric without populist government?
Thank you very much. The question around the relationship between, you might say, the political class and the bureaucratic class is an interesting one. I mean, what has happened is you've seen, for instance, tensions between these two, where the bureaucracy, and we've seen this in the UK, but also from time to time in Australia, and certainly currently in the US, when the bureaucracy sees itself as the defender of democratic institutions, and the politicians see themselves as, having a mandate in order to bring about these reforms. One of the key things which I think has happened is a couple of things. I think you've seen in the Australian context, for instance, more recently at the federal government level, they made some institutional reforms that made it less easy for the immediate dismissal of bureaucratic heads, secretaries of departments. There's now a process in place, whereas we saw, I think it was under Tony Abbott, the Night of the Long Knives, when a whole suite of departmental secretaries lost their jobs overnight. So I think that when there are some proper processes in place, both for appointment and, if necessary, for removal, then that creates a better understanding between the two. And so, I mean, the famous reference to Frankenfurter's advice and its decline has been debated a lot in Australia over the last 30 years. And I think that's one of the things that helps protect that idea, and the issue which I was talking about, the importance of evidence-based policy, depends on professionals being able to give ministers advice which they need to know, but they might not want to hear. Although in my experience, ministers are actually always keen to hear the advice. It's sometimes their officers and the ministerial advisors who get nervous about advice that doesn't fit the rhetoric, but ministers like to be told exactly what's going on. But I think that some of those bureaucratic protections that we've seen in force in the Commonwealth government actually helps create an environment which that type of open discussion is more likely to happen.
Thank you. Stephen?
Australia is a strange situation because we have the greatest dominance by Murdoch that he has in any country, despite the importance of Fox News and his English tabloids. But I think there is a general phenomenon that populism pervades the media, the critique of government, the critique of politicians. And I think that's actually more important. A program on current affair the other night interviewed farmers who didn't like the idea of power lines running through their properties, not because the power lines were close to their house, not because the cows don't like the power lines, but just because they could see them. So that sort of small man populism versus the government has become a very dominant ideology. It runs right through the mainstream media, particularly the television media. But that to me is the problem, that so many of our discourses are populist, and Murdoch's influence has diminished or failed in Victoria. But on the other hand, he succeeded in Queensland. One of the other things, if anyone in my paper, which I didn't read out, was the poem Law and Order, related to Peter Dutton. Law and Order is back, interfering with our peaceful suburban life, and that is the populist story on the television news every night of crime. Crime is a populist case. Who do we blame? We blame politicians, government, etc. So there is a culture also of blaming politicians, which, astonishing. People still talk about politicians' super, which was significantly reduced by John Howard and Mark Latham in about 2005. So to me, the populist undermining of government, the populist encouragement of distrust, even if it hasn't got the full conspiracy theories of social media, that is an even bigger problem than the Murdochracy.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to add anything?
I think people have heard enough from me already today, actually. No, I don't really need to add anything at all. I think we should probably go to lunch. Right?
You're hungry.
It's
Okay, I
midday.
see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to hold anyone up.
Any other questions? Okay, we are ready for lunch. So we have a break until 1:45, 12:45. So our second panel will start at 12:45. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope the lunch is ready. Let me see. Yes. Yes. Everybody.